For decades, the world operated under a fragile but recognizable order, where one dominant power set the rules and most others followed. That structure did not eliminate conflict, but it limited escalation and created predictable boundaries for global behavior. That system is now fading, and what is replacing it is not a new order, but a vacuum filled with competing ambitions. As more powers challenge each other simultaneously, instability increases not in one region, but across multiple fronts at once. The result is not just more conflict, but a world where crises overlap and reinforce each other. When tensions rise in one region, they now ripple faster and hit harder across economies, supply chains, and political systems globally. This shift did not happen overnight, but the signs have been building for years. What once looked like isolated disruptions are now part of a broader structural transformation of global power. At the center of this transformation is the gradual erosion of a single dominant authority. When no actor can enforce rules consistently, others begin testing limits, pushing boundaries, and recalculating risks. The United States once played that stabilizing role, projecting power across regions and deterring large-scale conflicts. Because rivals knew the consequences of escalation, many confrontations remained contained rather than expanding. But as relative power shifts, that deterrence becomes less certain and more selective. When enforcement is inconsistent, smaller actors begin to doubt whether intervention will happen at all. This uncertainty creates incentives for risk-taking, especially in contested regions. When multiple actors believe they can act without decisive consequences, the likelihood of confrontation increases significantly. At the same time, rising powers are no longer content operating within existing frameworks. They seek influence, security, and economic control, often challenging the very rules that once maintained stability. China's economic expansion and strategic positioning illustrate this shift clearly. As its capabilities grow, its willingness to assert influence also increases, reshaping regional dynamics in Asia and beyond. Russia's actions demonstrate another dimension of this transition. When revisionist powers reject the status quo, conflicts become not just territorial, but symbolic challenges to the global system itself. These shifts do not occur in isolation, but interact with each other in complex ways. When multiple powers act simultaneously, coordination breaks down and misunderstandings become more dangerous. Alliances that once seemed stable are also being tested under new pressures. When member states face internal divisions or shifting priorities, collective responses become slower and less decisive. This weakens the credibility of mutual defense commitments over time. If adversaries begin to doubt alliance cohesion, they may push further, increasing the risk of escalation. Economic interdependence once acted as a stabilizing force between nations. The assumption was simple: countries that trade heavily have more to lose from conflict and therefore avoid it. But that logic is now being re-examined as strategic competition intensifies. Instead of preventing conflict, economic ties are increasingly being weaponized for leverage and control. Sanctions, export controls, and supply chain restrictions are now common tools of statecraft. These measures do not require military action, but they still escalate tensions and deepen rivalries. As a result, economic systems are becoming fragmented along geopolitical lines. When markets split into competing blocks, efficiency declines and global cooperation becomes harder to sustain. This fragmentation introduces new vulnerabilities into supply chains worldwide. When production is reorganized for security rather than efficiency, costs rise and disruptions become more frequent. Energy markets provide a clear example of how instability spreads. When geopolitical tensions affect supply routes, prices react immediately, impacting industries, governments, and households simultaneously. These economic pressures then feed back into political instability. Rising costs and slower growth increase domestic dissatisfaction, which in turn influences national decision-making. Leaders facing internal pressure may adopt more aggressive external policies. This creates a cycle where domestic instability drives international tension, and international tension worsens domestic conditions. Technology is adding another layer of complexity to global competition. Advances in cyber capabilities, artificial intelligence, and surveillance are creating new arenas for conflict beyond traditional battlefields. These tools allow states to project power without direct confrontation. As a result, competition becomes constant and less visible, making it harder to define clear lines of escalation. Cyber attacks, disinformation campaigns, and digital sabotage can destabilize societies without triggering conventional responses. This blurs the boundary between peace and conflict in unprecedented ways. At the same time, military technologies are evolving rapidly. Hypersonic weapons, autonomous systems, and advanced missile defenses reduce reaction times and increase uncertainty during crises. When decision windows shrink, the risk of miscalculation increases significantly. A single error or misinterpretation can escalate faster than leaders can respond effectively. Nuclear deterrence still exists, but its stabilizing effect is more complicated today. While major powers avoid direct war, they engage in indirect confrontations that carry their own risks. These proxy conflicts can escalate unpredictably, especially when multiple powers are involved. What begins as a localized dispute can quickly draw in external actors with competing interests. Regional conflicts are no longer contained within geographic boundaries. Because of interconnected systems, disruptions in one area can trigger cascading effects globally. This interconnectedness amplifies the consequences of instability. A crisis in energy, trade, or security can quickly evolve into a broader economic or political shock. Financial markets reflect this growing uncertainty. Investors react faster to geopolitical signals, causing volatility that affects currencies, commodities, and capital flows. That volatility then feeds back into real economies. Businesses delay investments, consumers reduce spending, and governments face tighter fiscal constraints. Over time, this creates a more fragile global environment. Systems that once absorbed shocks are now more sensitive to disruption and less able to recover quickly. Migration patterns are also influenced by rising instability. Conflicts, economic hardship, and environmental stress push populations to move, creating pressure on neighboring regions. This movement can strain resources and political systems in receiving countries. As tensions rise domestically, policy responses become more restrictive and divisive. Environmental factors are adding further stress to the global system. Climate-related disruptions affect food production, water availability, and infrastructure stability. These pressures do not cause conflict directly, but they increase competition over scarce resources. When combined with existing tensions, they can act as accelerators of instability. Information flows have also transformed how conflicts unfold. News spreads instantly, shaping public perception and influencing political decisions in real time. This speed reduces the ability of governments to control narratives. As a result, crises can escalate faster due to public pressure and misinformation. Trust between nations is declining alongside these changes. When communication breaks down, misunderstandings become more likely and harder to resolve. Diplomatic channels still exist, but they are often less effective under heightened suspicion. Without trust, agreements are harder to reach and even harder to maintain. This erosion of trust undermines long-term stability. When actors expect conflict rather than cooperation, they prepare accordingly, reinforcing the cycle. Military spending reflects this shift in expectations. Countries are increasing defense budgets not just for protection, but to signal strength and deter potential threats. However, this buildup can also increase tensions. When one state strengthens its military, others respond in kind, creating a feedback loop of escalation. Smaller states are caught between larger competing powers. As pressure increases, they must navigate complex choices that can affect their security and economic future. This creates additional points of friction in the global system. Even minor disputes can escalate when they intersect with broader strategic rivalries. Trade routes and choke points are becoming more strategically significant. Control over these areas can influence global commerce and shift power balances. As competition intensifies around these locations, the risk of confrontation grows. Any disruption in these critical pathways would have immediate global consequences. Insurance costs, shipping delays, and supply uncertainties all increase in such environments. These factors contribute to rising costs that are ultimately passed on to consumers. The everyday impact of global instability is often indirect but persistent. Higher prices, slower growth, and reduced opportunities become part of the economic landscape. Businesses must adapt to this uncertainty by diversifying operations and managing risk more aggressively. This increases operational complexity and reduces efficiency. Governments face similar challenges in policy planning. Long-term strategies become harder to implement when the external environment is constantly shifting. This unpredictability affects not just economies, but social stability as well. When expectations are disrupted, public confidence in institutions can weaken. Over time, weakened institutions struggle to manage crises effectively. This creates a feedback loop where instability reduces capacity, and reduced capacity increases instability. The absence of a clear global leader amplifies all these dynamics. Without a central stabilizing force, coordination becomes fragmented and responses become inconsistent. Multiple centers of power create overlapping spheres of influence. This increases the likelihood of conflict where these spheres intersect. In such a system, deterrence becomes more complex and less reliable. Different actors have different thresholds, making it harder to predict responses. The world is not simply becoming more dangerous, but more unpredictable. Uncertainty itself becomes a source of instability, influencing decisions at every level. Understanding this shift is critical for navigating what comes next. As structures change, assumptions that once held true may no longer apply. The future will likely be defined by competition rather than cooperation. How that competition is managed will determine whether instability continues to rise or begins to stabilize. What is clear is that the era of predictable global order is fading. In its place is a system where power is contested, rules are challenged, and outcomes are far less certain. And if you want to understand where the next crisis might emerge, the answer is simple. It could be anywhere, and it could happen faster than expected. If you want deeper breakdowns of global power shifts and the forces shaping our future, subscribe to Global Power Brief and stay ahead of what comes next.